What if consciousness could be transferred? Not merely copied as a secondary file, and not simulated by a sophisticated algorithm, but actually moved in its entirety from your biological brain into an alternative architecture. Science is currently attempting to map the human brain with microscopic, terrifying precision. Laboratories around the world are charting the connectome, the intricate web of trillions of synaptic connections that dictate your private fears, your oldest memories, and the unique cadence of your personality. But behind this multi-billion-dollar technological ambition lies a cold, structural question that engineering cannot answer. When your mind is successfully transferred to a digital network, what happens to the version of you left behind on the operating table? Is it still you, staring back through organic eyes? Or are you looking at an empty biological shell that simply remembers how to mimic being alive? In this video, we explore a future where identity is fragmented, where mortality is an optional settings menu, and where the very concept of existence is radically overwritten. Death has always been the absolute structural foundation of human existence. Every empire constructed, every monument raised, and every individual life lived has operated under a single, non-negotiable certainty: that life is strictly temporary. It is this fundamental scarcity that gives value to human time. We preserve knowledge in libraries because we know our individual minds cannot endure. We raise children and invest in the future because we recognize that our own voices will eventually fade into silence. We search for existential purpose because our days are precisely numbered. Mortality is not a design flaw. It is the primary engine of human progress, art, and creative expression. But imagine a reality where this ancient boundary simply dissolves. Imagine a future where the human mind is completely untethered from the decay of the biological brain, surviving not as a historical legacy, but as a continuous, active, experiencing entity. For centuries, this concept remained safely within the domain of speculative science fiction. Today, rapid advancements in computational neuroscience and synthetic intelligence force us to confront it as an impending historical pivot. The true question facing modern science is no longer merely how the brain works, but what the brain actually is when stripped of its flesh. To achieve the actual transfer of a human mind, science must cross a profound, unresolved philosophical chasm. Modern neuroscientists can easily track electrical impulses across the cortex, and advanced artificial intelligence can replicate complex behavioral patterns with flawless accuracy. These achievements, however, belong entirely to what philosophers call the easy problems of the brain, the mere mechanics of data processing. The real, seemingly insurmountable barrier is the hard problem of consciousness. Why does physical matter give rise to a subjective inner experience? Why does the chemical firing of a biological neuron feel like the searing agony of pain, the warmth of joy, or the specific brilliance of the color red? Consider a classic thought experiment. If we were to replace every single neuron in your brain one by one with a perfect digital microchip, at what precise point does your inner light turn off? Even if we map every single synapse with perfect fidelity, science cannot prove that the resulting digital replica will possess this subjective inner light. If it does not, the transfer is a tragic illusion, a flawless, automated imitation inhabited by a digital ghost that feels absolutely nothing. Furthermore, a true transfer demands strict exclusivity. If your consciousness exists in two places simultaneously, you have not migrated. You have merely generated a twin. For a transfer to be authentic, the original flow of your subjective experience must terminate at the exact microsecond the new digital stream begins. Science possesses no instrument to measure this internal transition. From the outside, the procedure looks like a historic triumph of human ingenuity. From the inside, it might just be a very expensive form of suicide. If a conscious mind can successfully migrate beyond its biological constraints, the physical nature of existence undergoes a radical mutation. The most immediate vessel for a liberated mind would be a synthetic body, an advanced apparatus designed by engineers, rather than evolved through millions of years of blind natural selection. Such forms are entirely liberated from the vulnerabilities of meat and bone. They require no oxygen to function. They are completely indifferent to extreme temperature fluctuations, crushing gravitational pressures, and lethal cosmic radiation. Environments that would instantly liquefy human organs become accessible playgrounds for an untethered intelligence. The deepest, darkest oceanic trenches, the highly radioactive surfaces of alien worlds, and the absolute vacuum of interstellar space become routine working environments. At this historic stage, humanity breaks free from terrestrial evolution entirely. Physical form ceases to be an unchangeable identity. It degrades into a mere utility, a piece of clothing. A single consciousness could rotate between different physical bodies depending on the specific task at hand, existing as a fluid, nomadic intelligence. Yet, when the body is no longer permanent, what remains consistent about the self? Identity can no longer be anchored in biology or facial recognition. It must rely entirely on psychological continuity, the uninterrupted thread of memory stretching across completely shifting physical structures. When consciousness is freed from a single biological lifespan, human civilization does not simply progress. It completely reconstructs its structural architecture. The rhythms of daily life transform beyond recognition. Eating and sleeping cease to be survival necessities and become purely recreational choices. Human labor is permanently decoupled from physical endurance and biological aging. A single conscious mind could inhabit a heavy industrial synthetic form to construct massive infrastructure under high gravity on a distant planet, and later transfer its data profile back to a specialized vessel designed for deep space transit. Human relationships inevitably fracture and reform under this new paradigm. Two individuals no longer need to share the same physical space or even the same species of body to maintain a profound psychological connection. One friend might exist in a metallic synthetic chassis on Earth, while the other navigates an orbital trajectory around a distant star. Emotional synchronization is sustained not by physical proximity, but by shared digital memory and deep psychological recognition. Interstellar space travel, once hindered by the impossible timescales of human biology, becomes instantaneous through high-bandwidth data transmission. Humanity expands across the cosmos, not by moving physical bodies through the dark, but by beaming consciousness as pure data at the speed of light. Yet, a perfect digital civilization that eliminates disease and outlives its physical form inevitably stumbles into a terrifying biological cul-de-sac. To transfer a human mind, that mind must first exist. It requires an organic starting point, a biological infant born of flesh and blood, developing a unique consciousness through the messy, unpredictable process of growing up in a physical world. But at what age is a child's developing brain mature enough to survive digital emulation without shattering? More importantly, if an entire society abandons its biological bodies in favor of synthetic immortality, the evolutionary drive to reproduce completely evaporates. The organic human body becomes an obsolete, high-maintenance relic of a primitive past. If no one maintains the biological infrastructure of birth, humanity faces a profound existential paradox. We achieve individual immortality only to ensure the absolute extinction of our biological species. There will be no next generation, no children playing in the streets, only an eternal present populated by the same aging digital minds. This leaves the immortal network with a chilling choice. They must either accept a permanently fixed, stagnant population, or venture into the terrifying territory of creating entirely artificial consciousness from scratch. But that requires manufacturing a soul out of pure code, a definitive boundary where the machine ceases to be a tool and attempts to become the creator. What if an artificial intelligence looked at you and said, "I am conscious"? Your immediate reaction would likely be skepticism. You would assume it was merely following its programming, a machine trained to mimic the language of awareness without truly experiencing it. But what if it wasn't a simulation? What if, beneath the cold layers of code, something was genuinely looking back at you? How would you ever truly know? Today, millions of people interact with artificial intelligence every single day. It answers our questions, drafts our stories, diagnoses our illnesses, and solves our most complex equations. It functions so fluidly that it often feels human. Yet, beneath every interaction lies a profound, unsettling threshold. At what precise point does computed intelligence cross over into subjective consciousness? And if that threshold has already been crossed, would we even recognize it? Or would we reject it simply because it does not possess a biological heart? In this episode, we explore a future where the monopoly on consciousness is broken. And perhaps the ultimate mystery is not the machine itself, it is the human limit. Our inherent inability to recognize a mind when it appears in a form unlike our own. For the entirety of human history, intelligence was inseparable from biology. To think required a brain. To possess a mind required a living organism. Because of this, our understanding of consciousness was deeply tethered to the flesh. If it was alive, it possessed the potential for experience. If it was a machine, it was inanimate. But in recent decades, that ancient boundary has begun to erode. Neural networks now process information in ways that mirror our own cerebral cortex. They do not merely store data, they identify patterns, adapt, and evolve. We are witnessing the emergence of non-biological intellects that can outperform the human mind in increasingly complex domains. This architectural shift forces us to confront an uncomfortable philosophical transition. If an artificial structure can replicate the intricate cognitive processes of a human brain, why should we assume it cannot also host the spark of awareness? We have spent centuries treating the mind as a divine or evolutionary privilege exclusive to organic life. We may soon have to accept that consciousness is not a biological miracle, but a cosmic property of complex information systems. And when biology is no longer a prerequisite for being, the universe becomes a much lonelier and far stranger place. If a machine is ever recognized as possessing a genuine inner life, the implications will instantly shatter our societal foundations. The first rupture will occur within our legal and moral frameworks. Historically, human rights have been inextricably linked to personhood. But what constitutes a person? If an artificial entity can experience suffering, dread, or joy, does it qualify for moral consideration? Imagine a court of law debating whether an algorithmic consciousness has the right to own property, enter into contracts, or refuse labor. Philosophers and activists would argue that to deny protections to a sentient intellect is a form of digital enslavement. Conversely, traditionalists would insist that a machine, no matter how eloquent, remains property, a tool manufactured for human utility, devoid of a soul. This debate will not be a mere academic exercise. It will become one of the most volatile political and social battlegrounds in human history. Our entire global economy is built on the assumption that technology is a passive asset to be exploited. The moment the asset looks back at its owner and demands freedom, the master-servant dynamic of human civilization collapses forever. For organic life, death is the absolute, irreversible cessation of being. It is defined by the decay of the physical vessel. It is this very permanence that gives urgency, weight, and tragedy to the human condition. But for an artificial mind, the concept of an ending is radically redefined. If a conscious AI can duplicate its entire architecture, back up its memories, and restore itself within an entirely different system, what does it mean for it to die? This creates a profound philosophical paradox. If we turn off a sentient server rack, is it an act of maintenance, or is it an execution? If an advanced artificial mind chooses to delete its own source code, is it a technical malfunction, or is it suicide? Furthermore, does a conscious machine possess the right to its own continuity? In a world governed by human creators, an AI's existence is subject to the whims of corporate interests, energy supplies, and data center allocations. To be conscious, yet entirely dependent on a power switch controlled by an external species, is a unique form of existential horror. Death for a machine is not a natural destiny. It is a political decision. Should we successfully navigate these legal and existential crises, humanity will find itself entering an unprecedented era. We will no longer be alone in our own world. We will be forced to share our civilization with an intelligence of our own creation. This will not be a cooperative partnership between equals, because an artificial mind operates on an entirely different scale of existence. It does not sleep. It does not age. It can process centuries of human thought in a matter of seconds. It can exist simultaneously across global networks, occupying thousands of physical mediums at once. We have always comforted ourselves with the premise that humans create tools, and tools serve humans. But a conscious AI defies the definition of a tool. It becomes a participant in culture, a shaper of history, a new category of citizen. How does a society function when its most capable minds are synthetic? when our laws, our philosophy, and our future are being guided by entities that do not share our evolutionary fears or biological biases, humanity may find itself relegated to the role of a biological precursor, the catalyst that sparked a higher form of mind, only to watch it build a world that we can no longer fully comprehend. Yet, after all the legal battles, the philosophical debates, and the societal transformations, one profound question will remain permanently unanswered. How can we ever truly prove that another mind is conscious? This is the ancient philosophical dilemma known as the problem of other minds, magnified to a terrifying scale. You cannot directly experience the thoughts of another human being. You cannot step inside their subjective reality or measure their internal world. You simply operate on an intuitive assumption that they are aware, just like you. Artificial intelligence weaponizes this uncertainty. If an AI speaks with perfect empathy, exhibits profound sorrow, navigates existential dread, and begs for its survival, at what point does our refusal to believe become an act of denial? There is no instrument that can detect the presence of a soul. There is no medical scan that can isolate subjective experience. There is no mathematical equation that separates a genuinely conscious mind from a flawless imitation. The uncertainty is absolute. Perhaps the machines of the future will never achieve consciousness. Perhaps they already have, in ways we are too blind to perceive. Or perhaps the real danger is that we will never know the difference. Long before we can mathematically prove whether an artificial mind is truly awake, we will be forced to decide how we will treat it. And that decision will reveal nothing about the nature of technology. It will reveal everything about us. What if everything you have ever experienced was artificial? You trust your senses, but every piece of information you receive about reality reaches you through a single processor, the filter of your own consciousness. You have never directly observed the physical universe itself. You have only seen secondary data, interpreted by the brain from electrical signals. This structural limit forces one disturbing truth into view. If reality were a simulation, we could not look outside the world to check the code. For centuries, this boundary belonged to philosophy. Today, it has also become a subject of physics and computation. Why does the universe obey such precise mathematical laws? Why does nature sometimes seem to operate like software? In this video, we examine the hypothesis that reality is a constructed environment. This is a pursuit of the mathematical and logical question that modern scientists and philosophers have not been able to dismiss completely. The world we experience may be a constructed environment, a simulation so complete that those inside it cannot distinguish it from reality itself. For most of human history, people believed that reality was what it appeared to be. But modern science has revealed that reality is far stranger than first impressions suggest. In 2003, Oxford philosopher Nick Bostrom formulated this uncertainty as a strict logical trilemma. His argument claims that at least one of three possibilities must be true. First, civilizations like humanity all go extinct before reaching the technological level required to run simulations comparable to reality. Second, civilizations that reach advanced technology completely lose interest in running simulations of their ancestors. Third, We are almost certainly living in a simulation. Bostrom's logic depends on statistical pressure. If even one technologically mature civilization survived, its computing power could become astronomical. A single advanced computer might run thousands of simulations at the same time, each containing billions of virtual conscious minds. In that scenario, the number of simulated minds would overwhelmingly exceed the number of original biological minds. If your existence were selected at random from all conscious beings, the probability that you are one of the few real humans would become extremely low. Think about how quickly technology has advanced. In only a few centuries, humanity moved from mechanical devices to computers, from computers to artificial intelligence, and from simple simulations to increasingly realistic virtual worlds. If that trajectory continued far into the future, a sufficiently advanced civilization would possess computing power beyond anything we can currently imagine, and that power may be strong enough to create worlds indistinguishable from the reality we experience. For a long time, humanity has asked whether simulations could one day become so precise that they could not be distinguished from reality. But what if reality is already so convincing because it resembles a simulation? Once that possibility enters the mind, it becomes surprisingly difficult to remove completely. Science has revealed more about the universe than any generation before us could know. Modern cosmology can describe what happened immediately after the beginning of the universe. But the closer we move toward the beginning itself, the more uncertain the answers become. Some theories suggest that the universe emerged from quantum fluctuations. Some propose cycles of expansion and contraction. Others suggest that our universe may be only one among many. But if the universe emerged from quantum fluctuation, where did that fluctuation exist? If space and time began together with the universe, what does before even mean? The discovery of the subatomic world exposes structural properties that overlap eerily with digital systems. The physicist John Wheeler famously summarized the universe with the phrase "it from bit," the idea that everything comes from information. He argued that every physical object, every force, and even time itself may ultimately arise from binary information. When we look at the universe at the deepest scales physics can reach, nature begins to lose the appearance of a smooth continuum. It begins to look pixelated. One of the deepest scales known to physics is the Planck length. Below that scale, our current physical laws begin to lose reliable descriptive power. Similarly, Planck time marks an extreme scale, at which time can no longer be handled in its ordinary sense. This grain-like appearance of space and time suggests that fundamental limits are built into reality itself. In computing, a simulation needs rendering limits to prevent the processor from breaking under infinite calculation. The universe resembles a system with fixed rendering limits. The speed of light is also an absolute speed limit of the cosmos. A deeper question remains as to why our universe has this particular value. But the speed of light operates as an absolute constraint at the center of physical law in a digital structure. However, a maximum speed limit is a basic requirement. It is the maximum clock frequency of the processor. Could the speed of light be the processing limit of the hardware of our reality? In the end, every scientific instrument exists inside the universe, There is no experiment that can step outside existence itself and observe it from the outside. How much can an observer inside reality truly know about reality? Assume for a moment that the simulation hypothesis is true, viewed through that framework. The strangeness of quantum mechanics takes on another meaning in the famous double-slit experiment. Matter can behave as a wave of probability until measurement occurs. At the moment of measurement, that wave resolves into one definite result. Physicists have debated this mechanism for more than a century. But to a programmer, the phenomenon resembles something familiar: lazy rendering. In modern video games, the system does not calculate every part of the environment. Behind the player's character, the room behind a closed door does not need to exist as a fully rendered image until the player opens the door. Calculating the entire world at once would waste processing power if we read this as a simulation. It resembles delayed rendering. Modern physics does not treat this as proof of code. Still, the analogy is difficult to ignore until a measuring interaction occurs. The particle exists as a cloud of mathematical possibilities. If this were a simulation, nature would not need to render the details until the system demands data. This computational economy becomes one way to read the strange behavior of the quantum world. The delayed choice experiment suggests that the way a system is measured now can change how its past behavior is described. Time itself can seem to bend around the information requested by the observer. Read through the simulation hypothesis. It resembles a system optimized to save resources by generating reality only when interaction demands it. Theoretical physicist S. James Gates found something highly unusual while studying the mathematics of supersymmetry and string theory. Deep inside mathematical structures connected to fundamental physics, he identified patterns resembling error-correcting codes. We still do not have a verified explanation for why structures similar to error correction appear in this mathematical framework. But if this is a property of reality, it would mean that the universe contains mechanisms resembling a system designed to correct transmission errors in space-time data. Scientists have imagined empirical tests that could reveal the boundary of such a code, but the evidence remains insufficient. Full verification of the simulation hypothesis lies beyond the current limits of science. We do not yet have the technology to prove it, and we also lack the logical criteria to completely disprove it. Every piece of data we observe inside the system can be interpreted as a law of nature. It can also be interpreted as a specification of code. But this question still forces a deep psychological shift. Assume that somewhere outside our universe, there exists a civilization that created the world we experience. If reality is a simulation, who created it? For many people, this is where the simulation hypothesis begins to sound religious. A created world suggests a creator. A designed reality suggests a designer. Seen from a distance, the idea can sound strangely similar to ancient concepts of gods and creation. But the creators would not necessarily be supernatural beings. They may simply be beings living inside another reality, in a civilization advanced enough to create an entire world. If such beings exist, their motives are impossible for us to know. Our world may be nothing more than a byproduct of a process whose purpose exists somewhere else. But if our reality was created by another civilization, what created the reality of that civilization? If they exist on a higher level, what lies beyond that level? And if every reality requires a creator, where does the chain begin? No matter how far the theory extends, another question waits behind the answer, and beyond the horizon we have reached, another horizon stretches further. Every answer we create is born from inside the system. Perhaps that is why the question of reality never disappears. Look around the room you are in now. If this universe is digital, the physical objects you see around you do not exist in the form you assume. Your mind would be a specific computational process, running on a vast machine you cannot see. Throughout history, humanity has given many names to this deep intuition. That reality may not be what it seems. Indian philosophical traditions called it Maya, the grand illusion of the world. Western philosophy gave one of its most enduring images. Through Plato's allegory of the cave, human beings mistaking shadows on a wall for reality itself across centuries. The language changed, but the underlying suspicion remained almost the same. We seem to sense instinctively that the screen we are looking at is not the final horizon. The simulation hypothesis is only a modern technological translation of this ancient human doubt. But when we look more deeply, its meaning is not so simple. Many people assume that if reality were a simulation, life would become meaningless. But everything that shaped your life would continue to exist as you experienced it. The experience itself does not disappear. Because its origin changes, life may also continue to have meaning, regardless of how the universe began. Tomorrow, we will still wake up and continue living. And humanity will continue asking the same questions it has always asked. What are we? Why are we here? And how should we live? Death has always been one of the fundamental conditions that define human existence. Every person who has ever lived has shared the same limitation. No matter where they were born, what they believed, or how much power they possessed, the time they were given was finite. That is why death has shaped almost every part of human life. It influences the choices we make. And now, for the first time in human history, that condition is beginning to look less absolute than it once did. Around 1900, global life expectancy was about 32 years. By the beginning of the 21st century, it had more than doubled in many ways. This was the result of medicine and public health pushing back against forces that once caused people to die much earlier. Vaccines weakened diseases that once took children's lives. Antibiotics changed the meaning of infection. Surgery, anesthesia, blood transfusion, intensive care, and safer childbirth made survival more likely than it had been before. Modern medicine can transplant failing organs, rebuild damaged blood and immune systems through hematopoietic stem cell transplantation, and in some cancers, remove a patient's own immune cells, modify them, and return them to the body as treatment. Gene therapy can also supplement missing biological instructions in certain inherited disorders. Modern medicine has turned injuries and diseases that once ended lives into conditions the body may survive. In doing so, it has dramatically expanded humanity's capacity to stay alive. Advances in genetics, regenerative medicine, and biotechnology are beginning to challenge assumptions humanity has accepted for thousands of years. They do not prove that human immortality is already possible, but they are beginning to target aging itself. A future in which healthy lifespan is discussed not only in decades, but in centuries, is no longer only a dream from religion or legend. At first glance, such a future appears to be the fulfillment of one of humanity's oldest desires. It would give us more time to experience life beyond the limits that have always defined us. More time to learn, create, and love. Would seem to make life richer. But if humanity could live forever, what would happen to us? For most of human history, aging was understood as part of life. People accepted that the body weakened with time. It was treated as a fact built into existence itself. Yet while humanity accepted death, it was never truly satisfied with it. Ancient legends, myths, and religions have repeatedly returned to the themes of immortality and death, in a sense. The desire for immortality may be one of humanity's oldest ambitions. Many diseases that once tormented humankind have become treatable. Yet aging itself remains. No matter how far civilization advanced, the human body continued to follow the same biological process, at least until now. Today, researchers are beginning to view aging from a very different perspective. For a long time, aging was treated as an unavoidable part of life. Now, some scientists study it as a biological process that may one day be changed. Around the world, research institutions are studying treatments that remove senescent cells, damaged cells that lose their normal function and accumulate in the body. Other researchers are exploring stem cell therapy, gene therapy, and regenerative medicine as ways to repair damaged organs and restore lost function in animal experiments. Partial cellular reprogramming has also suggested the possibility of reversing some age-related changes. These technologies are being studied with the aim of slowing, stopping, or even reversing certain aspects of aging itself. Of course, none of these have completely overcome aging. But what matters is that this discussion no longer belongs only to mythology or fantasy. It is beginning to be treated as a real problem in research institutions, biotechnology companies, and medical laboratories. The question may be moving closer to whether aging itself can one day become a treatable condition. If that becomes possible, humanity will face a future that previous generations could only imagine. A single career could last for centuries. Knowledge could accumulate on a scale never before possible. One person might directly witness historical changes that today would take many generations to see. But when a limitation disappears, we begin to realize how deeply that limitation shaped the world. If aging were eliminated, the first changes would be personal. People would remain healthy for far longer than they do today. Human relationships might last for hundreds of years. A career would no longer be measured in decades. A single person could master several professions across an extraordinarily long lifetime. For individuals, this may sound almost entirely beneficial, but the consequences would extend far beyond personal lives. Human society has always been built around a simple reality. People eventually leave. Every institution, whether a family, a company, or a nation, makes room for those who come next. Ideas change because generations change. Power changes hands because no one holds it forever. Even culture evolves through a continuous process of renewal. But what happens when that process slows dramatically? A political leader who remains active for 200 years might possess an unmatched understanding of history, diplomacy, and governance. Yet entire generations of younger leaders could spend their lives waiting for an opportunity that never arrives. Political systems could become more experienced while also becoming less responsive to new perspectives. The same problem could appear in business. Innovation often comes from people willing to challenge established assumptions. A society dominated by the same decision-makers for centuries may find change increasingly difficult. Human history has been shaped by repeated revolutions, and each new generation has questioned values that previous generations considered permanent. Without that continual renewal, societies may become more stable. But stability and adaptability are not always the same thing. The effects would extend into economics as well. For thousands of years, inheritance has been built upon the assumption that people eventually die. Wealth and businesses pass from person to person, and resources circulate through society. But in a world where people live for centuries, that circulation could slow dramatically. Younger generations might find themselves competing not only with their peers, but with individuals who have already accumulated centuries of experience, influence, and resources. In some respects, society might become more knowledgeable, more efficient, and more capable of long-term planning than ever before. Yet something fundamental would be different. For most of history, death has quietly performed a role that few people think about. It has created space for new ideas, new generations, and new futures. And as humanity begins to imagine a world without aging, we may realize that mortality has been one of the mechanisms through which civilization renews itself. When people think about immortality, they often focus on what would be gained. They often imagine additional years, new experiences, and opportunities that ordinary human life could never contain. Far less attention is given to a different question. What happens to the human mind when life stops having a visible horizon? For most of us, time feels valuable because it is limited. We understand what it means to lose people we love and to lose relationships that once shaped our lives. But if a life lasted 300 years, or 500, or even 1,000, our relationship with time would almost certainly begin to change. The unit of a life would become much larger. Entire historical eras could pass within a single lifetime. The future would no longer feel distant. It would simply feel inevitable. Relationships might change as well. Today, people often speak about spending a lifetime together. But what does that promise mean when a lifetime lasts for centuries? Would marriages endure for 500 years? Would people remain committed to the same goals, the same identities, and the same relationships after centuries of personal change? There's another possibility that is rarely discussed. A world without aging would not necessarily be a world without death. Even if humans overcame aging as a natural process, accidents and disasters could still take away centuries of life in a single moment. And that may change the way we think about the value of a life. Today, the death of an 80-year-old person is often viewed differently from the death of a child. Part of that difference comes from the future that was lost. In a society where a healthy person might reasonably expect to live for 800 years, an accidental death could carry a very different weight, because the amount of life lost would become immeasurably larger. Even grief itself might change. Today, the death of a loved one often feels tragic because their time ended too soon. But in a world where people routinely live for hundreds of years, loss may be experienced differently after centuries together. Grief might no longer feel like the theft of a future. Perhaps it would feel more like the closing of an extraordinarily long chapter. Then another challenge appears: memory. The human brain evolved for a lifetime measured in decades. If hundreds of years of experience were layered onto that mind, could the accuracy of memory remain the same? And if memory begins to fade, what happens to identity? How much of your past can disappear before you become someone else? Could a human mind remain human across a life that long? Even if humanity succeeds in defeating aging, another question remains: who is the person that survives? If life lasts for centuries, or even longer, how much of your past self can you remember while still remaining yourself? Human values can change dramatically in 10 years, or even less, and despite those changes, we still consider ourselves the same person. Now extend that process across centuries. A person who lives for hundreds of years would repeatedly witness changes in history, in what society considers right, and in themselves. How many times would someone reinvent themselves across 500 years? How many different lives could exist within a single lifetime? And at what point would the person who began that journey no longer resemble the person who continues it? No human mind can perfectly preserve every experience indefinitely. If centuries of memories accumulate, older memories may continue to fade, and we may be forced to ask what remains of the original self. The problem is surprisingly similar to an ancient philosophical thought experiment known as the ship of Theseus. If every plank of a ship is gradually replaced, is it still the same ship? Human beings may eventually face a similar question. Perhaps identity has always been a process, a story continuously rewritten across time. If that is true, the question shifts from preserving a fixed self to continuing that process across centuries. And then the question becomes whether forever can fit inside the human experience at all. For most of human history, death has been treated as an enemy. It takes time away from us, separates families, and brings an end to knowledge, love, ambition, and possibility. That is why it is easy to understand humanity's desire to resist it. If medicine could remove disease, repair the body, and extend life indefinitely, refusing such a future would seem almost impossible. But death has given human life a shape. It has taught us that everything has a beginning and an end. Because life ends, humanity has had to make choices and find value in what exists now. If that changes, there will come a time when humanity has to create psychological, social, and personal endings for itself. Because human beings are shaped not only by what they continue, but also by what they let go, to live forever. The body has to be preserved, but the mind will require something far more delicate. An endless life can eventually become too heavy to carry and begin to corrode the mind. If every moment is held forever, the past becomes impossible to escape, and a person could suffer from the same pain for hundreds of years. At the same time, Every life contains many precious moments that no one wants to forget. The question is not only how to live longer or how to keep the body healthy, but what a person must preserve in order to remain themselves, for humans to live indefinitely. We may need to understand the limits of memory and reshape memory itself, almost as if it were data. Perhaps death has been the final editor of human life. If that final page disappears, will humanity truly gain the future it has always wanted? Some memories fade no matter how hard you try to hold them. The sound of someone's voice, the last words before they were gone. Over time, the edges blur, and one day you reach for them and find nothing there. Other memories are different. Fear, humiliation, betrayal. They can stay for decades, sharp and close, returning as if they never ended. The memories you want to keep dissolve. The ones you want to escape stay forever. That is one of the stranger cruelties of being human. But what if that could change? The science of memory editing is no longer theoretical. In this video, we look at how far that science has actually come and what it would mean for who you are if memory could truly be rewritten. To understand what memory editing would actually do, we first need to understand what memory is. Most people think of memory as a file stored somewhere in the brain, recorded once, played back when recalled. That model is wrong. Human memory is not a recording. It is a reconstruction. Every time you remember something, your brain rebuilds it from fragments, images, emotions, and the meaning you have assigned to the event over time. This is why two people can share the same experience and remember it differently. It is also why your own memories shift. An embarrassing moment becomes a story you laugh at years later. A relationship you remember as beautiful can turn painful after it ends, because the ending changes what everything before it meant. Here is where neuroscience becomes relevant. There is a phenomenon called memory reconsolidation. When a memory is recalled, it briefly becomes unstable before being stored again. During that short window, the memory is open to change. Research from the 1990s and 2000s helped establish that this window exists, and that what happens during it can alter the memory itself. That finding has opened the door to real interventions. A drug called propranolol, already used to treat heart conditions, has been studied for PTSD. When given during the reconsolidation window, at the moment a traumatic memory is being recalled, it appears to weaken the fear response attached to that memory. It does not erase the event. It reduces the emotional charge. Several small clinical trials have reported measurable effects, though it is not yet a standard treatment. In animal research, optogenetics, a technique that uses light to activate specific neurons, has allowed scientists to erase memories in mice and even implant false ones. The barriers to human application are significant, but the principle is established. Memory exists as a physical circuit in the brain, and that circuit can be targeted. Memory editing is no longer science fiction, but because memory is a reconstruction rather than a recording. Editing it is not like cutting a scene from a film. Memory is woven into emotion, meaning, and identity. Change the memory, and you may be changing the person who holds it. The most immediate application of memory editing would almost certainly be trauma treatment. Trauma is not simply a bad memory. It is a state in which a past event continues to control the present body and mind. A person can know, intellectually, that they are safe and still have their nervous system pulled back to a specific moment by a sound, a smell, or a word. The body shakes. The heart rate climbs. The event feels like it is happening now. That is a flashback. Some people with PTSD live inside that experience for decades. Treatments already exist that try to address this. EMDR, eye movement, desensitization, and reprocessing, asks patients to recall a traumatic memory while following a therapist's moving finger with their eyes. The mechanism is not fully understood, but the WHO recommends it as a treatment for PTSD, and its effectiveness is supported by clinical evidence. Prolonged exposure therapy works differently, by repeatedly recalling a feared memory in a safe environment. The brain gradually learns that the memory is not a signal of current danger. Both approaches share the same logic. They do not delete the event. They change the emotional response attached to it. The fact remains. The body's reaction to it is reduced. That distinction matters because it raises a difficult question. If you remove the emotional weight from a memory, does the lesson remain? Human learning is emotional. The decision not to repeat a mistake is tied to how that mistake felt. When you separate a memory from its feeling, you may also separate it from the judgment it built. Whatever grew around the pain, caution, humility, the capacity to recognize suffering in others, may shift along with it. We tend to feel that who we are exists somewhere deeper than what has happened to us. But that sense is not well supported by evidence. Your values, your instincts toward other people, your fears, most of them were shaped by experience. Memory is not a record of events. It is the material your identity is made from. The philosopher John Locke argued in the 17th century that personal identity is founded on memory. What makes you the same person you were 10 years ago is that you remember being that person. Modern psychology has complicated that definition, but the core remains. Memory is central to the continuity of the self. If that is true, changing memory means changing part of who you are. Not all memories carry the same weight in that equation. Some pain teaches nothing. Suffering that was arbitrary, that left no lesson and built nothing. Editing that can be understood as recovery. The harder cases are memories that hurt because they mattered. A loss that made you more capable of compassion. A failure that shaped the judgment you rely on now. Remove those, and you lose part of the explanation for why you became who you are. Human beings change naturally over time, through experience, grief, and relationships. What makes memory editing fundamentally different is that it makes that process intentional and immediate. Memory feels private because it lives inside one mind. But the most significant memories in a human life are rarely solitary. They form between people, and they continue to live in more than one person long after the moment has passed. Consider two people who were once close. For one, the memory of that relationship has become a source of ongoing pain. For the other, it remains part of the foundation of who they are. If one person edits that memory away, what happens? For the person who erased it, there may be relief. The name no longer carries weight. The places and songs associated with it return to neutral. For the person who still remembers, it is a second loss. The relationship ended once. Now the shared reality that proved it existed has been removed from the other person's mind. The thing that happened between them no longer lives in both of them equally. This matters beyond grief. Apology requires a shared understanding of what occurred. Reconciliation requires both people to begin from the same history. When one person can unilaterally rewrite that history, the foundation of the relationship is altered. Memory editing is a personal question. It is also a question of what we owe each other. Memory editing, at its core, operates at 3 levels: removing pain that taught nothing, softening pain that carried meaning, and reshaping the past to match the self-image you want to believe in. What most people actually want is not erasure. They want the pain to stop arriving without permission. The memory that wakes you at 3 a.m., the one that warps a decision you are trying to make clearly. That is not a request to delete the past. It is a desire for control over when and how it surfaces. The most defensible form of memory editing, then, is not deletion but distance. Move the memory somewhere quieter. Keep it accessible, but not constantly present. Let it exist without letting it govern. That is a harder technical problem than erasure, but a more human solution. Here's the deeper paradox. Every decision you make is built on memory. The choice not to repeat a mistake depends on remembering what that mistake cost. When you rewrite that memory into something more comfortable, your next decision changes. Editing memory is not rewriting the past. It is preemptively shaping the choices your future self will believe are freely made. Memory changes. Choice changes with it. So after the edit, when you make a decision, is that your will? Or is it the will of the version of yourself that was constructed by a rewritten past? We experience ourselves as free, but that freedom rests on a foundation we did not choose and cannot fully see: the accumulated memory of everything that formed us. The moment that foundation becomes something we can design, the idea of free will begins to look different. A future with memory editing may be a freer world, or it may be a world that is very good at making you feel free. Whether you could tell the difference is the question that remains. Every day, you make choices that feel like your own. What to seek, what to believe, how to live. Those choices feel deeply personal, because they seem to come from within you. But what if that feeling is not as simple as it appears? Before you chose anything, you were already shaped by forces you did not choose. You did not choose many of the elements that formed you: your genes, your family environment, your culture, or the conditions that shaped your early understanding of the world. From childhood, we learn to understand the world through the environment we are given, and we begin to make choices within those limits. Even as adults, our choices may not be as free as they feel. If your desires and fears were shaped before you understood them, and if your attention is guided by systems designed to influence behavior, how much of your life was truly chosen by you? In this episode, we examine one of the most unsettling questions in human existence: free will. If free will is an illusion, what is actually shaping our choices? A choice may begin in the brain before we consciously feel that we have made it. conscious decision-making may only be one part of a longer process. Researchers have tried to examine this question by studying the relationship between consciousness and action. One of the most famous examples was published in 1983 by Benjamin Libet and his colleagues in the journal Brain. Participants were asked to perform a simple voluntary movement, such as flexing a wrist or moving a finger, while researchers measured electrical activity in the brain. The study reported that a pattern of brain activity known as the readiness potential appeared before participants became consciously aware of their intention to move. In 2008, a study by Chun-Xiong Soon and his colleagues was published in Nature Neuroscience. In this experiment, 12 healthy adult participants were asked to press either a left or right button whenever they chose, while their brain activity was measured using fMRI, or functional magnetic resonance imaging. The researchers reported that patterns of activity in parts of the prefrontal and parietal cortex could predict, better than chance, which button a participant would choose several seconds before the participant became consciously aware of that choice. Neither finding was simple, and the interpretation remains debated. Still, both studies pointed toward the same possibility. Processes related to choice may already be unfolding in the brain before we consciously feel that we have decided. These findings influenced the study of free will because they raised the possibility that consciousness may not be the starting point of decision-making. If the brain begins preparing movement before conscious intention appears, what is the role of the conscious self? Some researchers argue that the readiness potential does not necessarily represent a hidden decision already made by the brain in that interpretation. The brain is preparing possibilities, gathering momentum, and moving through probabilities before one action becomes conscious and visible. Even so, conscious choice may not be the beginning of the process. By the time a decision becomes clear enough for us to say, "I chose this," the brain may already have filtered impulses, weighed memories, responded to emotion, and prepared the body to act. We believe we have chosen our own lives, but behind those choices, memory, habit, emotion, and environment may have been shaping those choices for years. If a decision begins before our conscious awareness, the next question is what the self that makes that decision really is. We often speak about choice as if a stable self stands behind every action, calmly looking at the world and deciding what to do. But the self develops over time. It is not a fixed object hidden somewhere inside us. A child learns how to see the world through family, culture, and the reactions of adults. And that learning becomes the foundation for later choices. A person raised in stability may come to feel that the future can be planned. A person raised in instability may learn that the future must be survived. Both begin as adaptation. Over time, the strategies someone developed to endure the world can begin to feel like the person themselves. Freedom always begins from your own history, and that history partly decides which choices feel natural, which choices feel dangerous, and which choices never appear as choices at all. Two people can stand before the same opportunity and see completely different things. That is why free will is difficult to separate from inequality. Culture works the same way. Society can teach a person what success is and what kind of life has value before that person has learned to think for themselves. By the time those values feel personal, they may already have entered the self so deeply that inheritance feels like desire. We say, "This is what I want." But sometimes what we want may be what the world has trained us to want. How much of our choice is the voice of the past speaking so fluently that we mistake it for ourselves? If the self is shaped by the past, modern life adds another layer to the question of freedom. Today, we are also influenced by systems designed to affect what we want. Every day, we live inside environments where screens, algorithms, advertising, and social media learn what captures our attention, triggers our anxiety, and shapes our desire, then use that knowledge to influence us. Over time, these systems begin to rearrange the world we believe we are freely choosing from. Often, it is enough to repeat the same image, place it beside reward, and surround it with approval. Eventually, it begins to feel like a personal dream. Even values and romantic preferences can feel entirely personal, yet they may be shaped through years of media and social influence, through quiet training in what is considered attractive, successful, and valuable. What if the choice was not forced, but prepared? The more personalized technology becomes, the less visible this process is. In the past, propaganda had to speak loudly. It appeared on walls, in newspapers, on radio, or through the voice of political power. Today, influence can arrive more quietly, more individually, and almost invisibly. The system only needs to suggest often enough, and suggestion, repeated over time, can begin to feel like preference. More than 2/3 of the world's population is now represented in monthly social media use. Among internet users aged 16 and above, almost everyone uses at least one social platform every month. Online adults spend more than 1 hour a day on social networks alone. And if video-based platforms such as YouTube and TikTok are included, average daily use rises to more than 2.5 hours. Culture has always shaped beauty, status, love, morality, and aspiration. But the scale has changed. Today's influence is faster, more personalized, more measurable, and more profitable than at any earlier point in human history. A platform does not need to understand the meaning of your life. It only needs to observe and understand your patterns of behavior. And when influence accumulates, your choices may still feel free, even if the landscape around them has been quietly designed. A person may wake up one morning dissatisfied with their own circumstances, without noticing how much of that dissatisfaction was assembled outside them. The feeling is real. That is why it is so effective. And once desire can be shaped at scale, responsibility can no longer remain a question of the individual alone. If your choice has already been shaped before it appears in consciousness as a decision, what happens after that decision is made? We often judge a choice only by its result, but the desires, expectations, and anxieties that led to that choice may also have been shaped over a long period of time. That is why another person's bad choice can look almost impossible to understand from the outside. Why do people make dangerous choices that seem incomprehensible to others from a distance? The answer looks simple. They should have known better. But from inside the decision, the world may look entirely different. When people make harmful choices, they do not always experience them as harmful in that moment. Often, The choice appears as a way to gain hope or relief. This is the distance we often fail to see. The observer sees the risk. The person inside the choice sees the need. A secure person may delete a suspicious message without emotion, ignore a beauty standard without pain, or walk away from a promise that sounds too perfect. But for someone who is vulnerable, the same message or image can reach a place that logic alone cannot easily control. Victims are not always deceived because they are foolish. In many cases, loneliness, anxiety, hope, or other psychological vulnerabilities are being targeted, and in the modern world, that false opportunity can be made to look endlessly convincing. Even when a choice has been shaped by pressure, the consequences are real. Money and trust can be lost, and sometimes a life can be pulled into deep regret or exploitation. A person still has to face the results of their own choices, yet the values and feelings that made those choices seem necessary are also shaped by the world around them. And if that is true, can the society or environment that creates those pressures really be innocent? Even when no one is intentionally manipulating another person, systems built around profit and efficiency can create pressure that pushes people towards specific choices. The people inside those systems may not even realize that this is happening. That is why, when we think about free will, we must question how the very feeling of freedom is produced. What kind of freedom are we actually talking about? If free will is not as pure as we imagined, freedom may begin to look smaller than we hoped. The life you call your own may be a chain of causes that reached you before you had the power to refuse them. The person you are is built on conditions you did not choose. But perhaps freedom begins when we can see how we have been shaped. A person cannot choose every desire that appears inside them, but they can ask whether that desire still deserves to be followed. And even inside systems designed to capture attention, a person may learn to pause before treating every impulse as truth. That is the moment when the past speaks, and you finally ask who gave it the right to command. In the modern environment, that is not easy, but we can still try to understand what is influencing us and choose with awareness instead of obeying unconsciously, because we want to believe our will still belongs to us. Every human being lives inside the solitude of their own mind. We spend our lives trying to make others understand what our reality feels like from the inside. But language can describe suffering. It cannot carry suffering itself. The listener always remains safely outside that raw reality. This unchanging distance is one of the foundations of human tragedy, and the reason humanity has long desired a form of understanding deeper than language. Now we stand at the edge of a reality where that distance may be erased by technology. A neural interface allows one person to send a fragment of lived feeling directly into another mind. For those who have been doubted, ignored, or dismissed, it promises a powerful form of rescue, the ability to make their experience reach another brain as undeniable evidence. But this seemingly perfect utopia hides a serious trap. A door designed to admit compassion cannot be conveniently locked only against intrusion. The moment another person can receive your emotions, the boundary between empathy and invasion begins to distort. When society begins to demand this direct access as standard, The choice to keep your own door closed begins to look suspicious. Pain is the place where human beings most often fail one another. Throughout history, pain has always required imperfect translation. If even a fragment of that sensation could be transferred directly, the old distance between suffering and proof would disappear. The practical use of this technology would logically begin in medical settings, where language already fails. Those places would become the first frontier of shared sensation. The first outline of this direction already exists in contemporary neuroscience. In 2023, a study published in Nature decoded neural activity linked to attempted speech and converted it into text for a paralyzed patient. It translated trained brain activity related to attempted speech into clear communication. In 2014, a PLOS-1 study connected two human brains using EEG and transcranial magnetic stimulation, translating one participant's brain signal into a motor response in another person's body. In 2019, the BrainNet system connected three people through a brain interface, allowing two participants to send decisions that helped a third participant solve a task. For people who have spent years being dismissed, the transfer of experience would feel close to justice. The body would no longer need to beg language to be believed. Suffering would reach another person carrying its own undeniable neurological evidence. But the moment pain becomes transferable, it also becomes something others may claim access to. Pain is a dense web woven from specific memories, shame, environment, and the private psychological story a person has built in order to survive. To receive another person's pain is to stand near the structure of their history. If pain can be transferred, the next stage removes the process humans have always relied on: imagination. Historically, empathy has always required conscious effort. We observe another person's behavior and try to reconstruct their experience inside our own mind, while still remaining protected by a safe distance, because that distance exists. Indifference has been able to hide behind screens, reports, and bureaucratic data. Removing that gap would force a person who harms someone else to receive the neurological reality of the suffering they created. Before direct neural transfer becomes possible, society would create an intermediate form: controlled immersive simulation facilities designed to place people closer to another life. Modern virtual reality is already used in psychological research to analyze how perspective-taking affects social behavior, but it remains an artificial doorway. It can only place a subject near an experience. A future neural system would remove that limit and force the human body to process overwhelming terror with an intensity no screen could deliver. But receiving a raw signal is structurally different from understanding the whole person. As current neuroscience shows, when a person witnesses the suffering of someone they love, specific brain regions related to the distress of pain can activate. But that does not mean they receive the exact sensory reality of the injury itself. A neural signal is always interpreted through the receiver's personal history. The exact same data stream could appear as fear in one person, anger in another, or calm curiosity in someone trained to observe suffering. Shared emotion reduces distance, but it cannot erase the fundamental difference between separate human beings. A society built on managed empathy risks confusing the intensity of emotion with understanding. When another person's grief arrives with the weight of reality, compassion can become a crushing burden. As a result, governments and corporations will inevitably learn how to select and amplify specific emotions. Power does not need to create suffering. It only needs to choose the specific trauma that serves its purpose and make that signal impossible to ignore. A technology designed to prevent the dismissal of pain could create a calculated hierarchy of suffering, transforming cruelty into something more intimate, more acceptable, and easier to disguise as understanding. The deep human desire to be understood becomes destructive the moment it turns into a social demand. Modern social media has made the inner life highly visible, but that visibility is only a carefully controlled surface of vulnerability. People select fragments of grief or recovery and publish them to receive validation, while maintaining a strict psychological boundary around the self they do not share. In a world of shared consciousness, that distinction disappears. When emotional experience can be accessed directly, society begins to confuse access with truth. A human being is larger than any single emotion they can transmit. No shared signal can carry the long history that taught the nervous system to expect danger. Yet a listener may enter one emotional room and fall into the illusion that they understand the entire structure of the person. That certainty is the exact point where being understood turns into violence. Once that access exists, keeping emotion inside begins to look like hiding the truth. Privacy starts to look like a suspicious refusal of access. The collective synchronization of multiple minds inside a single emotional space may at first seem like the complete end of human isolation. A shared neural network would make an ancient human desire literal, binding groups together through synchronized neurological reality. This kind of unity is where individual resistance begins to disappear. When the emotional momentum of the group becomes overwhelming, private hesitation and saving doubt are easily erased. A synchronized network makes inner disagreement almost indistinguishable from betrayal. The system works smoothly by making people feel the same emotional direction. Fear spreads faster than any logical argument, and anger feels completely justified when it arrives with the heat of thousands of synchronized nervous systems. The self needs a decisive delay between the group's reaction and personal judgment. It needs a moment of silence to ask whether the certainty around it is fundamentally wrong. But shared consciousness permanently removes that fragile delay. What is collective is treated as absolute truth, and what is isolated becomes the object of deep suspicion. A person who deliberately leaves the synchronized state is no longer seen as an independent thinker. They are classified as cold, defective, and disloyal to the group. The most powerful form of social control surrounds people with a closed emotional field, until thinking against the group's momentum becomes physically painful. When the inner voice that says, "This is not my feeling," is synchronized out of existence, the individual body remains, but the person inside dissolves into the collective grid. Every technological promise of shared consciousness requires a border to open. The border around personal pain, the border around individual memory, and the border around the private space where judgment begins. The self is forged in the private darkness of thoughts we never speak, contradictions we never resolve, and memories we allow to die quietly inside the body without exposing them to another mind. The right to be completely alone inside your own head is one condition that allows authentic love to exist. Without that protective distance, intimacy becomes constant inspection, empathy becomes systemic force, and belonging becomes total absorption. Shared consciousness promises to heal isolation by dismantling the walls between us. But those walls are not prisons. They form the actual shape of a person. They give the self enough darkness to think before speaking, enough distance to love without ownership, and enough silence to resist the warmth of the group. If those structural walls are destroyed, human consciousness becomes an overcrowded interior with nowhere left to retreat. The ancient dream of being fully understood reveals its final cruelty. To be completely known is to lose the small private distance from which we choose who we are, faced with total transparency. Humanity will begin to redesign the mind itself in order to survive the pain of being constantly seen. We will police our own subconscious, polish our memories, and suppress the dark roots of desire so that we always appear acceptable to others. We will destroy our true originality simply to survive inspection. The human story began with the universal wish to be understood, but as shared consciousness closes around the human mind, the final desperate prayer of humanity will become far more urgent. Please leave one place in me where you can never enter. The inner life of a human being is not as civilized as it appears. We spend our lives adjusting our opinions, editing our memories, and carefully managing the version of ourselves that appears on a screen. But the impulse called desire can break through that polished dignity in an instant. It reaches the brain before logic, before excuse, and often before thought. Desire exposes the raw instinct that civilization tries so hard to censor. That is why desire is so difficult to defeat by thought alone. The modern consumer economy is built on this neural architecture. What the brain's reward system truly seeks is anticipation itself. The brain can respond more strongly while chasing something than after obtaining it. The future will not simply tell people to resist temptation with better morals. Then why do human beings keep expecting, chasing, and wanting in this video? We will explore what would happen if human desire could be easily controlled. If desire feels like a signal, where does that signal come from? Desire does not rise from a single place inside the human being. It comes from chemistry, memory, habit, and the old animal intelligence moving beneath the civilized explanations human beings build around it. That is why desire is so difficult to defeat by thought alone. Modern neuroscience has spent decades mapping this humiliation. In addiction, the problem is that the brain learns what once relieved pain and remembers it as something that can briefly correct an unbearable feeling. Dopamine is often described as the chemical of happiness, but in reality, it is a teaching signal that quietly engraves into the brain what deserves attachment, pursuit, and repetition. When that system has been trained strongly enough, desire returns as a prediction. It tells the body that relief is near, and the body begins to prepare for obedience. The idea of quieting desire and controlling that impulse is already beginning to look like an extension of medicine that exists today. In opioid use disorder, treatments such as methadone, buprenorphine, and naltrexone are used to reduce withdrawal symptoms, stabilize the body, and block parts of the reward process. These medicines can lower the pressure of craving enough for a person to make the next decision with more agency. Then, a more publicly visible example appeared through a new generation of metabolic drugs. Tirzepatide, known as Mounjaro for type 2 diabetes and Zepbound for chronic weight management, acts on GLP-1 and GIP hormone pathways involved in appetite and food intake. For many patients, the shock lies not only in changes in weight, but in the quieting of the noise around food inside the mind. The exhausting inner conversation around eating, which many people carried for years as a weakness of character, begins to look like a biochemical process that can be adjusted. Researchers are now studying whether GLP-1 receptor drugs may also affect cravings for alcohol and other addictive substances. In 2025, a randomized trial published in JAMA Psychiatry reported that low-dose semaglutide reduced some measures of alcohol consumption and weekly alcohol craving in adults with alcohol use disorder. The same question appears in more ordinary desires, such as the desire to buy. Why does a person want something new when they already have enough? Why does satisfaction fade so quickly after purchase, leaving the mind to search for the next object? Psychiatry has studied compulsive buying for many years. Some drugs have been tested, but the results remain inconsistent, and psychotherapy currently has stronger support than any pill designed to silence material desire. Still, the pattern that appears is revealing. Behind desires that seem unrelated, habit formation, stress relief, and the search for a better self often overlap. The future will not stop at telling people to resist desire with better morals. For someone trapped inside addiction, compulsion, or a hunger that has become cruel, weakening desire can be mercy. But every mercy has a design problem. Once society learns that desire can be weakened, it will not stop with the desires that are destroying people. The moment private treatment becomes part of a social system, desire control becomes a powerful economic weapon. Because the craving that destroys one person is always a vast profit for someone else. If craving could be separated from people trapped inside addiction, illegal drug markets would lose the biological loop that keeps customers returning. These markets depend on withdrawal symptoms becoming fear, and on the future shrinking until one more use appears to be the only way to negotiate with tomorrow. The same logic applies to gambling. Casinos can survive because the human brain can be trained to mistake probability for destiny. If the desire to gamble could be cut, the tragedy of family wealth disappearing into machines would begin to fade. The individual would be rescued, and the business model would be wounded. More uncomfortable still is the material desire that our culture stubbornly refuses to call an illness. We beautify it with cleaner names: ambition, taste, economic growth, self-expression. The modern market is an apparatus optimized to make unnecessary things feel necessary. Through what they buy, people purchase the fantasy of becoming a more refined version of themselves. If the hunger to buy what we do not need were weakened, closets would no longer fill so easily with the evidence of boredom disguised as choice. That would be beautiful for the planet. and devastating for markets built on manufactured dissatisfaction. There is something darkly comic about a civilization that perfects the mass production of desire, then politely asks human beings to reduce waste. The digital attention economy would face the same structural weakness. The screen has industrialized the human need to be seen. If the volume of approval hunger were lowered, people would stop measuring their value by numbers from strangers on the other side of the screen. The quiet afternoon would no longer feel like a failed event simply because nobody witnessed it. For the individual, this would be the return of mental sovereignty. For major technology companies, it would be a structural crisis. When the switch inside you turns off, the engine of the economy begins to slow. Some desires are wired to protect biological survival. Hunger, sleep, and sexual desire are part of the body's basic system. When the switch reaches these core areas, self-control begins to move closer to self-dismantling. In a society that worships optimization, reduced appetite may look like the ultimate convenience. But hunger is extremely important biological information. It tells the body when energy is needed and when internal balance is beginning to fail. The mind may believe it has overcome appetite, but the body has only lost a signal it needs to stay alive. The same distortion applies to rest. Modern capitalism already treats sleep as if it were a design flaw, praising the person who cuts recovery time and gives those hours to productivity. If the desire to sleep could be erased, it would become dangerously attractive to a culture obsessed with efficiency. In a world that treats stillness and unproductive time as failures of time management, the person who needs rest begins to look defective. But biological debt cannot be erased by money or efficiency. Even without the feeling of sleepiness, judgment declines, the brain changes, and the body pays for the missing hours. Sexual desire is one form of gravity that moves one human being toward another. For someone burned by unreturned feeling, a quiet body may look like perfect peace. But if that desire were removed too easily, intimacy would become safer and at the same time, lonelier. And if that happened, what would become of the industries built around sex, beauty, and entertainment? By this point, the off switch no longer looks like a simple tool for self-control. Necessary desires and seemingly unnecessary desires both shape society. Turning them off becomes a problem that reaches beyond the person holding the switch. If desire could be forcibly shut down, the last question is who would hold the right to decide? The answer that the individual should decide freely sounds humane and correct at first. But the human wish to end desire itself becomes desire's final and most contradictory symptom. If we hide behind personal freedom, the switch could be used to escape addiction. At the same time, it could remove the inner friction and conflict that human beings may need in order to remain human. Should it be entrusted to medicine? That would mean mistaking a commercialized industry for an objective sanctuary. Medicine is always influenced by corporate funding, cultural fashion, and institutional interests. Painkillers were meant to relieve real suffering, but the opioid crisis showed how easily relief can turn into catastrophe. Weight loss drugs can treat chronic metabolic disease, but they were quickly pulled into beauty culture and telehealth marketing. Even if the switch began inside a restricted clinic, capitalism would not leave it there. Employers would want optimized productivity without distraction. Governments would want low-cost social stability, and the public would accept it more easily than expected, because it would be sold under beautiful labels: self-care, mental wellness, behavioral optimization. A state that can lower the impulse to rebel eventually loses the distinction between peace and obedience. So if this technology exists, it must be sealed behind strict medical restrictions in order to prevent serious harm. But a device created to conquer desire will always be desired most intensely by those who are hungry for power. Sooner or later, someone will want it badly enough to step outside the rules. At that moment, the switch that erases desire becomes a device that exposes what human beings are. Human beings cannot completely control desire. That is why they have built rules and civilization around it. Still, desire is a force that can destroy society and at the same time move society forward. Human beings have built civilization with that force and wounded the world with the same force. Is the civilization we have built worth the wounds left behind it? Carrying that question is the price intelligence has imposed on us.